The 1980s may be defined by high-tech dystopias, but this decade of action blockbusters truly began 1,000 miles away with the release of Raiders of the Lost Ark, an old-fashioned throwback to the adventure serials of the 30s and 40s. Despite this anachronism, the exploits of Dr. Henry Indiana Jones Jr. seized the public imagination, and Raiders would go on to become the highest-grossing film of 1981 and an all-time classic.
Unlike most Hollywood franchises, Raiders was intended to have sequels from the very beginning, with each installment telling a different episodic adventure, much like the books and movies that inspired it. But in keeping with that grand tradition, these sequels were never quite able to live up to the original, leading to a gradual slump in quality, followed by perhaps one of the sharpest declines we've covered yet. So how did this epic adventure wander so far off course and wind up abandoned to the sands of time, waiting to be unearthed and used for evil by the most shameless of fortune seekers?
Indiana Jones faces off against his most ruthless foes yet, Hollywood studio execs.
After rapping on 1973's American Graffiti, future bajillionaire George Lucas was rediscovering his passion for the movie serials he had loved as a child. He dreamed of creating an updated version of these old crowd pleasers that could electrify a whole new generation of audiences. It was called Star Wars, but he did also develop the concept of Indiana Jones around the same time. Originally named Indiana Smith, Lucas, along with director Philip Kaufman, fleshed out a character that was part-time archaeology professor and part-time globe-hopping treasure hunter.
Both Lucas and Kaufman both busy on other projects, 5 full years would pass before the idea was eventually revisited. After completing Star Wars in 1977, Lucas was on vacation with his wife and fellow little boy trapped in man's body Steven Spielberg, to whom he pitched his Indiana Smith concept. Spielberg loved everything about it, except for that name, and by the next year, scriptwriting duties for the newly rechristened Indiana Jones project were assigned to a young, pre-Empire Lawrence Kasdan, tasked with fashioning some kind of cohesive story out of the countless ideas that Lucas and Spielberg were coming up with.
In lengthy story meetings, the two dumped a shocking amount of sometimes conflicting suggestions for potential scenes, characters, and quests on their new writer. Kasdan tried adamantly to incorporate and expand on most of these ideas, but his initial draft was deemed too long.
And as I had written it on this, there were no computers then.
The team took their time to refine the story, streamlining it until it could keep an audience in its momentum from start to finish. Raiders of the Lost Ark actually begins in the middle of an expedition, wasting no time in giving us the far-off locales and ancient ruins that we all came for. The year is 1936, and Indiana Jones is deep in the heart of the Peruvian rainforest, searching for a Chachapoyan fertility idol in a booby-trapped temple and only barely making it out alive. Though the idol is taken by his arch-nemesis René Belloc, this opening sequence establishes Indy as a rough and tumble soldier of fortune with only one true fear: Snack.
That's just my pet snake, Reggie!
The next scene introduces his secret identity, Dr. Henry Jones, a mild-mannered university professor teaching horny co-eds all about legitimate archaeology while he's illegally grave robbing on the side. We then begin our main quest as the college dean Marcus Brody introduces Jones to 2 government agents who are looking for Abner Ravenwood, his former friend and mentor. Ravenwood was mentioned in a Nazi communique about an archaeological dig for the lost city of Tanis, which in reality has always been a very found city. They're looking for the headpiece to the Staff of Ra in order to find the location of the Ark of the Covenant and use its fabled destructive power towards total domination.
The feds want Indy to find the Ark before the Nazis do, so he decides to first look for Ravenwood, who was an expert on Tanis. Instead, he only finds Ravenwood's daughter, Marion, with whom he had a brief affair back in the day when she was apparently quite young.
I was a child.
How young exactly? Well, according to the novelization, he was 25 and she was 15. And according to those early story meetings, Lucas thought it would be, quote, outrageous but amusing if she was as young as 11 or 12. Fortunately, the dialogue was left vague enough for them to retcon this later, but still.
Oh. Turns out Marion is in possession of the headpiece, but she refuses Indiana's offer and turns him away. Hitler's occult op squad arrives shortly after and threaten to torture her, but Indy returns and the two fight off the goons together, joining forces to track down the Ark. The adventure moves to Cairo as Jones, Marion, and their Egyptian companion Salah infiltrate the German dig site and discover the Ark's hidden location. They attempt to retrieve it from the snake-filled Well of Souls, but are found almost immediately and trapped there instead, while the Nazis make off with the ancient WMD. Indy and Marion are able to find their way through the 9,000 snakes that Spielberg demanded to have on set.
We need about 7,000 snakes in addition to the 2,000 we have here to make it work.
Before briefly stumbling into a spooky haunted house and successfully escaping the crypt, conveniently right outside a Nazi camp.
Knowing the Germans will try to move the Ark immediately, Indy ventures to stop them by any means necessary, leading to one of the great Indiana Jones cliches, the fistfight with a big burly henchman followed by a thrilling chase sequence. Both examples here are some of the most memorable action scenes in cinematic history, so it's probably no wonder they became an almost obligatory staple of the series. Our heroes manage to spirit the Ark away on a small fishing boat, but are taken prisoner by a patrolling German submarine, who recapture the Ark and Marion, while Jones manages to escape and survive by hanging on to the submarine, I guess?
Anyway, he follows the Nazis to their ceremonial grand opening and equips the grenade launcher, threatening to blow up the Ark if they don't let Marion go. But Belloc, being the Joker to his Batman, calls his bluff. He knows Jones too well. He knows he can't stand to destroy such a priceless piece of history. After all, they're very much alike. Their methods have not differed as much as you pretend. I am a shadowy reflection of you. It would have taken only a nudge
to make you like me, to push you out of the light.
So Indy's taken hostage as well, tied to a post with Marion while the Nazis finally open the Ark and unleash the wrath of God all over their own faces. Returning to America with the sacred artifact in hand, Indy is excited to place it in the safekeeping of a museum that will exploit it for ticket revenue as God intended. But Indy is incensed to find that the government has claimed possession of the Ark and added it to their own top secret arsenal of apocalyptic weaponry.
Despite test screenings failing to generate much interest, Raiders immediately became the #1 film when it was released in the summer of 1981.
The year's most entertaining movie. In a nutshell, our review is don't miss it.
Its financial success only continued after that, and more importantly, it would quickly become ingrained in popular culture. To this day, so many of its iconic scenes are instantly recognizable to people who've never even seen it. And aside from the underage romance and some classic 1930s racism,
well, these Arabs don't care if we kill each other.
Raiders remains incredibly entertaining, still epitomizing what an action-adventure movie should be. The style of the film would immediately inspire imitators and rip-offs, not to mention overt references throughout other media.
I'd like to go on record as being opposed to the use of violence for purposes of conflict resolution. However,
luckily, Spielberg and Lucas had always planned on taking Indiana Jones on many different adventures, so a sequel was never really in doubt. The question was, how would they follow up what was quickly becoming one of the most popular and influential films ever made?
Lucas had sold the Raiders concept to Spielberg under the condition that it would be made into a trilogy. And in true Lucas fashion, he pretended to have the sequels already planned in advance.
It turned out George did not have 3 stories in mind. We had to make up all the other subsequent stories.
In the absence of these sequel ideas, Lucas threw around a number of wild concepts like putting Indy in a haunted castle or on the Great Wall of China with dinosaurs. Spielberg wisely rejected all of these pitches, but both agreed that the next film should be darker in tone. For purely creative reasons, of course.
Part of it, I guess, was I was going through a divorce at the time and I wasn't in a good mood.
They debated a few potential MacGuffins from world mythology to base the adventure around, but decided instead to just kind of make one up. The Sankara stones seem to have been inspired by Shiva lingam stones, but as far as we can tell, there's no Hindu legend about lingam stones glowing like some damn Dragon Balls when you bring them together. The villainous Thuggee cult was likewise inspired by real-life bandits and thieves of 14th century India, or more accurately, the insane exaggerations made about them by 19th century Brits. To no one's surprise, the government of India objected to these elements of the script and demanded changes before allowing Spielberg to film there. After some failed negotiations, the shoot moved to Sri Lanka so production could begin on Indiana Jones's next completely new adventure. Sadly, it would arguably prove to be his last.
The opening scene of Temple of Doom finds us in 1935 Shanghai, technically a year before the events of its predecessor, and begins similarly enough. Dr. Jones at the tail end of a mission, although this time, he successfully made off with the loot and is now meeting with his contact Lao Che in order to secure payment. Here we meet Indy's love interest for the film, Willie Scott, played by Kate Capshaw, an American living in China as a performer. A very, very loud performer. It's not exactly love at first sight. When Lao Che tries to take the treasure by force, Indiana uses Willie as a hostage, tersely continuing the negotiations via Lazy Susan, a sequence any aspiring cinematographer should take note of. As the deal nears completion, Indiana unwittingly ingests a poison cocktail, his undercover partner is shot, and all hell breaks loose as the clubgoers flee. With his typical bravado, Jones fights Lau's henchmen, dodging bullets while trying to keep track of the antidote which has been knocked into the crowd.
Securing the life-saving serum, Jones and Willie escape to a car waiting outside, driven by arguably the most charismatic character of the franchise, Short Round, played by a 12-year-old Ke Huy Quan, now known as the sweetest man in Hollywood.
To all of you out there, please keep your dreams alive.
A brief car chase ensues until Indy, Willie, and Short Round make it to the airport, only to board a plane owned by Lao Che, but not before an oft-overlooked cameo from actual Crystal Skull High Priest Dan Aykroyd. As Jones,
you call him Dr. Jones,
Dr. Jones and the others catch a mid-flight nap, the pilot and co-pilot bail, taking with them the only parachutes. Narrowly avoiding becoming a meat and scrap metal pancake on the side of the Himalayas, they eventually wash up on the shores of the remote Indian village of Mayapur.
The villagers convince Jones to journey to Pankot Palace, once abandoned but now under the control of a new Maharaja. Not only do the villagers believe that an evil grows there, but someone from Pankot came to Mayapur and stole a sacred lingam stone, potentially due to a belief that it is one of the 5 Sankara stones. And once Thanos gets all 5 stones, wrong franchise. Worst of all, the residents believe that people from the palace kidnapped all of the children in the village.
Once agreeing to investigate the palace and the kidnappings, Indy and the others traverse the countryside on elephant back, Willie's consistent shrieks and screams echoing across the landscape. Upon reaching Pankot, the group is welcomed by the remarkably young Maharaja, and here we get to indulge some apparently timeless Orientalism as Willie bears witness to the local fare, including eel-stuffed snake, eyeball soup, and monkey brains, each one garnering a more extreme reaction than the last until she finally faints. While these shenanigans play out, Indy involves himself in a conversation with the Maharaja who, despite his young age, is aware of the infamous reputation of Pankot Palace and the associated Thuggee cult, and announces his resolve to rule differently than those before.
That night, after a particularly contentious round of flirting with Willie, Indy is attacked in his room by an unknown man who he quickly dispenses with before finding a secret passage that leads beneath the palace. Jones, of course, goes to investigate, which leads to a great booby trap scene, and since Spielberg had already filled a set with snakes and raiders, for Temple of Doom, he decided to go with bugs.
Do the bugs.
No.
Do the bugs.
No.
Okay, we gotta get Robert down here. We don't have enough bugs to make the scene work.
This is around the time that Willie's screaming begins to feel like some sort of torture tactic, an eternal tornado siren for a storm that never comes.
The biggest trouble with her is the noise.
Once escaping death by Spike, Jones, Willie, and Short Round stumble upon something they'd been assured didn't exist: the Thuggee cultists engaging in religious ritual.
In one of the most iconic moments in film history, we watch as cult leader and world's least hygienic doctor Molaram performs a wildly invasive heart surgery, a visual that was seared into the mind of every adolescent who saw it. When the ritual ends, Indy, seeing the stolen lingam stone, goes to retrieve it. Because it's an Indiana Jones movie, he and the others are quickly discovered and captured, but not before Jones sees that the villagers were right. Their children were kidnapped and have been put to work in the mines beneath the palace, searching for the final 2 stones. Short Round is forced to watch as Jones is fed a hypnotizing blood smoothie that renders him zombified before being sent to work in the mines himself.
Shortly thereafter, Thuggee CFO Chatter Lal initiates a new ritual in which Willie is put into a cage that is slowly lowered into a fiery chasm while a possessed Indiana helps. Finally, Short Round is able to break the spell on Indy, who then fights the cultists while trying to prevent Willie from getting char-grilled. After saving Willie, Indiana knows they have to free the children of Mayapur, and so he engages in a Thuggee boss battle, all the while the Maharaja, who we've learned is a member of the cult, a young Thuggee if you will, tortures him via voodoo doll. We then get a time-honored minecart chase with some incredible miniature work, before the tense standoff finale where Dr. Jones flexes nuts and destroys the rope bridge both he and the Thuggees are standing on.
With Molaram being dutifully worked at by Crocodile Bile, and the Maharaja free from the cardiac connoisseur's possession, Indy returns to Mayapur with the Sankara stone and the children in tow. The villagers reunite with their crotch goblins, and Indy and Willie engage in some soft BDSM PDA, signaling their enduring love that lasts all of the 12 months before the events of Raiders take place. While it has its drawbacks, mainly Willie's incessant screaming, which even Kate Capshaw found excessive,
and then she screams, hello, can she do anything else besides scream?
It's hard to argue that Temple of Doom isn't the perfect sequel to Raiders. With a darker tone, a series of bold set pieces, and some of the most memorable moments of the series, and possibly movie history, Todd has all the hallmarks of a great adventure flick. It was so much darker than Raiders, it's actually the reason the PG-13 rating was invented.
And I felt there should be a rating in between PG and R. And so I called Jack Valenti and said, can't there be an in-between rating? And I actually said it could be like PG-14 or PG-13. Jack Valenti was able to institute, for the first time in many decades, a brand new rating.
Strangely, it isn't as well remembered by Spielberg, who has said it's his least favorite of the original three.
You know, of all the Raider indie films, Temple of Doom is my least favorite.
Which is extra strange since he met his future wife on its set, and it's very possible the moment he fell for her was caught on film.
You wanna go to the prom? Yes. You wanna go to prom with me?
Despite the fact that in retrospect, its creative differences from the first were an undeniable part of its success, the horror-like vibes don't seem to have sat well with Lucas and Spielberg, who, as they began searching for inspiration for a third installment, decidedly shifted away from the moodier elements that make Todd the revered classic that it is.
During its initial release, though, Temple of Doom had received a mixed critical reception, and Spielberg seemed to take away all the wrong messages from this. He was convinced that the people just wanted Raiders again.
I just wanted to bring back the spirit of the original Raiders and have some fun. I wanted to bring the cast back that I had missed in Temple of Doom.
So when Lucas approached him with an all-new story, Spielberg vetoed it. Now, in Spielberg's defense, this script did begin with Indy looking for the Holy Grail in a haunted Scottish castle and fighting a ghost, before journeying to Africa to rescue a 200-year-old pygmy from the Nazis, and being rescued himself by Sun Wukong the Monkey King from Chinese folklore.
But rather than counter-offering with his own original quest, Spielberg was determined to retread old ground. Not only would he suggest that the movie focus on Indy's relationship with his father, subject matter that he's infamous for repeating, but he would insist on consciously emulating Raiders, only this time with more goofy humor and less graphic violence, all to increase the family-friendly appeal and hopefully penetrate the public consciousness as much as the original did.
And just bringing the spirit of what got us so pregnant with the series.
The final film would be cobbled together from various different drafts and rewrites, and instead of taking us on a new adventure, it would be content to remind us of that one we already loved.
Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, or as we like to call it, Indiana Jones and the First Crusade again, starts way back in 1912, when a young Indy is exploring caves with his Boy Scout troop and stumbles upon a shady group of thieves searching for the lost Cross of Coronado. Already deeply in love with the idea of museums,
it belongs in a museum.
The teenage Jones attempts to retrieve the crucifix from the gang of thugs. In the process, every significant event that we know about from his past occurs within a single afternoon. He finds his first MacGuffin, he uses a whip for the first time, he gets his fear of snakes, he discovers his love of grave robbing and meets his lifelong fashion icon. He even gets Harrison Ford's chin scar, because that origin story was just begging to be told.
Flash forward to 1938, where the Raiders' deja vu kicks into high gear. In an almost shot-for-shot recreation of the university scene from the first film, Marcus informs Indy that his aloof father, Dr. Henry Jones Sr., has gone missing while seeking out the location of the Holy Grail, something he's been obsessed with his entire life. After meeting with his father's financial backer, Walter Donovan, Indy is tasked with finding the attention and validation that Daddy never gave him. Oh, and the Grail too.
The real pleasure was in finding each other.
Before he departs, he receives a mysterious package containing his father's diary, which includes all his research notes on the Grail. He and Brody then travel to Venice to meet with Elsa Schneider, a German associate of Henry Sr., who Indy immediately starts thirsting over.
Make me very happy.
They trace the clues in the diary to a catacomb below the ancient city, where they pick up more clues and are attacked by swarms of rats, this movie's answer to the snakes and bugs of the previous installments. And in order to top those two famous scenes, Spielberg resorted to playing God.
We had a rat breeder, we had a couple of rat breeders, and we started breeding rats.
So our animal handlers gave birth to something like 2,000 living rats. Do we have any shame? No, we don't.
After escaping the sewers, Indy and Elsa are pursued by a team of assassins. When their leader is questioned, he claims to be part of a secret order that has protected the Grail since ancient times and tells Indy that his father is being held at Castle Brunwald on the German-Austrian border. When the two arrive, they find it to be under Nazi control, but attempt to infiltrate it using a terrible Scottish accent.
That gun and caught a sniffle.
Deciding to switch to his usual two-fisted approach, Indy finds his dad, played by Sean Connery, with his actual Scottish accent. He manages to briefly free him before they're betrayed by Elsa, who we learn is a secret Nazi that's been fucking both father and son.
It's not always shared.
To no one's surprise, it turns out that Donovan is also a secret villain in league with the Nazis, and both Henry Joneses are tied up while the diary is taken straight to the Fuhrer himself. Wacky hijinks ensue as Indy and his father escape the castle and pursue the Nazis to recover the diary. Somehow beating Elsa to the book-burning rally, Indy confronts her and takes back the diary, as she tries in vain to plead that she's not that much of a Nazi.
I believe in the Grail, not the swastika.
The buffoonery continues when Jones Jr. and Sr. attempt to escape on a German Zeppelin but are forced to abandon ship for a small biplane before being shot down by themselves and forcing an entire flock of seagulls to die for the cause. All the while, Indy and his father gradually stop bitching at each other and start to gain a mutual understanding and appreciation.
The pair reunite with our old pal Sala to try and recapture the magic of Raiders, but also to rescue Marcus Brody, who was taken prisoner by the Nazis with a map to the Grail's location. If the Raiders callbacks weren't overt enough yet, we get an obnoxiously similar vehicle chase through the desert where Indy, his father, and Sala are able to free Brody and dispatch all the Nazi troops. They arrive at the canyon just behind Elsa and Donovan's team, and watch them idiotically sending soldier after soldier to die in the temple's booby traps. Our heroes are immediately found and captured, can you believe it? And Donovan shoots Henry Sr., mortally wounding him and forcing Indy to obtain the Grail to save his life.
Using his own knowledge, his father's notes, and his newfound faith in Force perspective, Indy makes it through the traps and finds a magical 700-year-old Knight Templar guarding a chamber filled with false grails, only one of which will bring eternal life. The others will all bring instant death. The Nazis arrive shortly after, and Elsa intentionally selects what she believes to be the wrong cup, handing it to Donovan, who sips from it and ages rapidly into a dollar store Halloween decoration. Indy wisely chooses a plain cup fit for a carpenter, and the knight confirms his choice, but warns not to take the Grail past the entrance of the temple, which is the barrier of the immortality it brings.
Indy uses the Grail to save his father's life, but Elsa selfishly attempts to leave the temple with it, causing an earthquake that tears the entire temple apart. Despite just learning that she cannot take it past the seal, Elsa still risks her life to go after the Grail, and Indy, completely out of character, is still simping way too hard to let her go.
Your other hand, honey, I can't hold you!
But her overwhelming greed causes her to fall out of his grasp. Then, as if that scene didn't just happen, Indy falls into a fissure himself within reach of the Grail, and his dad has to convince him not to fucking die for it. Regardless, our team narrowly escapes the crumbling chamber, and together, they ride off happily into the sunset, closing the book on the adventures of Indiana Jones. Right? Right?
The Last Crusade ended up outgrossing Temple of Doom in the worldwide box office and has garnered a reputation over the years as being the second best film of the series, so perhaps Spielberg's attempts to redo Raiders could be considered successful. But on closer inspection, the movie fails to live up to the legacy of the original, despite Spielberg's best efforts to invoke its cultural staying power. Not only does it water down the visceral thrills that Raiders did so well,
it's pretty gory, pretty gross, but I love that effect.
But the attempts to give Indy more character development somehow make the character less interesting. Connery and Ford have good chemistry in some of their scenes, but compared to the life of adventure we had imagined for him, the reality of Indy's lifelong dick measuring for his dad's approval is a total letdown.
With the trilogy now complete, Spielberg moved on from Indiana Jones, and the film series would ostensibly end on what many considered to be a high note, while Lucas continued to squeeze the property for the multimedia opportunities it afforded. The franchise may have been absent from theaters, but the 90s and early 2000s would be full of Indiana Jones novels, comic books, video games, and amusement park attractions. Lucas even produced a big-budget television series following a young Indiana Jones, who seems a lot more like a young Forrest Gump, somehow crossing the path of every famous historical figure of the 20th century.
Like Thomas Edison, Theodore Roosevelt, Sigmund Freud, Pablo Picasso, and Vladimir Lenin.
Without Spielberg's moderating influence, Indy was free to take on all the out-there quests that Lucas always wanted, producing titles like Indiana Jones and the Ape Slaves of Howling Island by R.L. Stine, and Indiana Jones and the Philosopher's Stone by J.K. Rowling. But after resurrecting Star Wars to divisive results, Lucas's appetite for new indie adventures would grow beyond these outlets, and he would set his mind to digging up the franchise, whether the world needed it or not.
And I stand here tonight as an executive producer and sometimes writer, struggling to bring Indiana Jones 4 to life.
Despite Spielberg going on record and saying he was done with the franchise,
when I was done with Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, there was a reason that I invented the shot of Harrison riding a horse into the sunset. because I thought that brought the curtain down on the trilogy. And by the way, in a sweet, nostalgic way, it was fine with me at the time.
From his own telling of it, it was the fans that began to winnow down the filmmaker's resolve to leave it be. And while it's hard to believe that Harrison Ford would be excited about reprising, well, any role he's taken on, he was apparently the first one to break down and suggest the gang get back together and give it a go. It took some convincing.
One more story.
But eventually Spielberg relented and Lucas brought forth an idea that would play on 50s B movies and center around aliens. This historical era also allowed Spielberg to replace the now all too familiar Nazi antagonists with America's rivals during the Cold War, the Russians.
A 2005 draft entitled The Atomic Ants was given to David Koepp, who would continue on as screenwriter as the film mutated towards its final form, with names such as Destroyer of Worlds and Indiana Jones and the Son of Indiana Jones, before they landed on the seemingly obvious Kingdom of the Crystal Skull. Production began in 2007 under the codename Jean.
This genre about a low-born scamp,
Genre. So we went around the whole time being called genre.
And less than a year later, audiences got to return to the world of the adventuring archaeologists we all know and love.
The opening scene of Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull finds its eponymous hero in the trunk of a car driven by up-to-no-good Russians. It's here we meet our villainess of the movie, the rapier-wielding Irina Spalko, played by reliably monotonous Cate Blanchett. Spalko is apparently Ukrainian, though you'd never know it from her British accent.
Because I know things.
It's revealed Indy has been driven to the warehouse that we see at the end of Raiders, in which Spalko hopes to find an alien body, and she seems to hint at the fact that Jones was around for the Roswell crash. After helping Spalko find the preserved corpse, Indy's partner betrays him, apparently because he's a capitalist, and we indulge our first action scene in which we all pretend Harrison Ford isn't 60-something years old, complete with a dusting of fan service and some incredibly unnecessary CGI prairie dogs.
Jones escapes, casually survives a nuclear test, and heavily irradiates himself before being picked up by the feds, who grill him about Roswell and Spalko's intentions, which, we learn, are to get her hands on
artifacts she thinks might have paranormal military application.
A quick Red Scare later, we're back at the hallowed halls of the university doing the same fucking bit from the previous movie, and the first one, in which the current dean comes to inform Jones that he's been fired. Intending to leave for Germany, Indy packs up and boards a train, only to be intercepted and derailed by a suave, motorcycle-riding, leather jacket-wearing greaser named Mutt Williams, played by post-holes and pre-livestream street fights Shia LaBeouf.
Do it! Mutt informs Dr. Jones that an old colleague of his, Dr. Harold Oxley, has gone missing. Oxley, who acted as Mutt's father figure growing up, was last seen in Peru, where he had reportedly found a genuine crystal skull before heading for the lost city of Akator. Indy admits that he himself has even gone looking for Akator in the past, but to no avail. It turns out that not only has Oxley been kidnapped, but Mutt's mother has gone looking for him, only to find herself in the same predicament. She has relayed the message to Mutt that if they're not able to get their hands on the crystal skull that Smog-Nog and Oxley stashed away, it's lights out for the both of them.
Smog in the noggin.
Mutt reveals his mother, one of the many Marys Dr. Jones ran through,
Shut up. That's what mother you're talking about.
managed to escape and sent him some of Oxley's notes. Although he's not entirely sure what's going on, Indy's curiosity has been piqued, and after a forgettable chase scene with some KGB agents, he successfully decodes Oxley's cryptic letter. As the pair follow Oxley's riddle to a Peruvian sanitarium, we get another installment in the gumpification of Indiana Jones, learning that he spent time with Pancho Villa.
Bullshit.
Although Oxley is nowhere to be found, his cell contains a series of clues carved into the stone walls.
The scavenger hunt then leads Jones and Mutt to the gravesite of a Spanish conquistador, where they're treated to a very aggressive and hands-on Cirque du Soleil routine. Exploring a series of catacombs, they find the crystal skull hidden by Oxley, which they quickly find out exhibits some unnatural physical properties.
What is this thing?
Wondering why Oxley would bring the skull back to the place in which he first discovered it, Jones and Mutt go back above ground and are confronted by a group of Russians along with Mac, the man who betrayed Indy in the opening scene.
With Indy predictably caught by his foes, we flesh out Mac's character,
a gigantic pile of money,
and are reintroduced to Spalko, who is overjoyed that Jones has led them straight to the Crystal Skull. To be honest, up until this point the movie isn't great, but beyond the opening scene, hasn't massively deviated from what you'd expect from an Indiana Jones movie. Obscure language translation, a little fisticuffs, and some good old grave robbing. But here we begin to fully explore Lucas's vision for a 50s B-movie, when Spalko conducts an alien autopsy, complete with glowing blue inner cranium.
We finally meet Mad as a Hatter Harold Oxley, and after a little light psychic torture, we find out that Mutt's mother, who the Russians have apparently recaptured, is actually Marion from Raiders, which is probably supposed to make us have more of an emotional investment in the story, but just feels stale. Auto-author Oxley Vander gives another map hidden in a riddle, and at this point, Jones and Spalko really begin hitting it off.
Here, sono, the Portuguese word for sleep.
Yes, good.
After a rushed escape, we're forced to endure the tired and true quicksand bit when it's revealed that not only is Marion Mutt's mother, but Mutt got that dog in him. That dog being Indiana Jones.
You are named after the dog?
Suddenly, the family's free, just in time for the Russians to stride out of the bushes and recapture Jones, Oxley, and Mutt, and recapture Marion because there's no other possible way to progress this story.
Oh, for the love of God.
The Russians proceed to drive tank-like forestry mulchers through the fucking Amazon so that Spalko, with Jones and co in tow, can caravan out to Akator in the whip. Mutt learns he was probably a hate-fuck baby, hits us with a classic, "You're not my dad," and then for the second time in just over 5 minutes, they stage a daring escape. What follows is not only the most mind-numbingly stupid scene of the franchise, it has gone down in collective memory as one of the doofiest action scenes of all time. Indy wreaks havoc on the Nature Shredder 3000s, and we begin a brutally long sequence in which the two factions drive on endless stretches of cleared jungle and square off in increasingly absurd feats of athleticism. Mac reveals he's actually a double agent. Spalko and Mutt rapier duel between two moving vehicles, with Mutt getting hit in the balls by so many CGI plants that he eventually stops noticing them, and we reach the moment in the movie that Robert Downey Jr. warned us all about.
Never go for reap.
With Spalko getting away with the crystal skull, Mutt turns a silly stuck in the vines bit into a fucking ninja warrior course when he swings on vines with the troop of wild monkeys. At this point, the 2008 mindset of we can do anything with CGI is fully realized, and even though it's short, the movie becomes exponentially harder to watch over that handful of seconds. After Mutt and his posse of capuchin killers fail to stop Spalko, she miraculously drives into an anthill and has to abandon the chase. We then get to collectively microdose the Phineas Gage accident when Marion drives off a cliff on purpose so she can land their car on a tree that gracefully leans over, gently depositing them into the river where they peacefully drift away. Into the gaping maw of a 3-tier waterfall! They of course survive this without acquiring a single bruise, and your brain is so numb from the past 15 minutes and change of CGI carnage that it's hard to even care.
The crew discover a cave entrance to Akator, and we begin the most boring episode of Legends of the Hidden Temple ever. Without any clue as to how, Chief Parrot Head Harold Oxley solves another puzzle and unlocks the entrance to the main temple. It's revealed that Mac is still working for Spalko, and she and her band of Russian ruffians are hot on their heels, following a trail of tracking beacons the quadruple agent has been leaving behind. Faced with a final ornate door they must bypass, Indy and the others figure out the code word is melon and enter the Martian throne room. Here they find not only 12 more crystal skulls, but the full skeletons of 13 aliens who came to Earth as archaeology hobbyists and are caught up to by the Russians.
Spalko, believing she'll be able to enter prestige mode and go Super Saiyan on the world, reconnects the stolen skull to its body. It seems she might get her wish. The Crystalian intimates through Oxley that it wants to give them a gift.
A big gift.
The throne room disintegrating around them, a portal to the unknown opens, and the heroes make a run in the opposite direction, sensing their luck may have finally run out. Spalko sticks around to see the 13 skeletons combine into Paul from the movie Paul, and as the formula dictates, she gets her comeuppance for meddling in the affairs of interdimensional beings. The temple self-destructs, with Indy, Oxley, Mutt, and Marion barely escaping, just in time to witness the valley break apart to reveal a flying saucer.
We end on a high note because, as we all know, knowledge is treasure and treasure is knowledge. Dr. Jones is now dean of the college, and then we get to wrap up this quadrilogy of rom-coms with the obvious ending, a wedding!
Huzzah! 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 Huzzah!
It almost seems like the leading role is going to be left to Mutt, who's ditched his nickname awfully quick.
Well done, Henry!
Thanks, Ox.
But psych, your boy still got them moves, and we get the most pleasantly memorable part of the movie, the classic John Williams theme.
Kingdom of the Crystal Skull debuted strong, pulling in over $100 million on its opening weekend. And based on ratings alone, audiences and critics alike were generally kind to it, which seems hard to believe in retrospect. Die-hard Indiana Jones fans, however, were not as favorable.
Get down there, boy!
And even Spielberg sided with those who disliked the aliens, stating that he never liked the MacGuffin, which is pretty rich considering he scolded Shia LaBeouf for his take on the subpar final product. And describing it as subpar is generous. Crystal Skull isn't just a stain on the franchise, it's Totino's pizza roll grease on the seats of a Rolls-Royce Phantom. While one could argue it keeps the same levity and sense of adventure as its predecessors, it is so ludicrously stupid and riddled with CGI nonsense that it's hard to believe it exists within the same universe.
Remember where I said we need 7,000 more snakes? I could say, you know, we need about 140,000 more ants.
While the filmmakers would largely shrug off any criticism of the film, the Indiana Jones IP entered its second stint of hibernation, and with the ever-progressing age of its iconic star, many believe Crystal Skull would mark an ugly end of a beloved world.
Unlike most of our case studies, the decline of the Indiana Jones series can be placed squarely on the shoulders of its original creators. Together, Spielberg and Lucas crafted one of the most iconic movie franchises of all time, but in their own ways, both contributed to its slow descent. Lucas, one of the greatest ideas men in Hollywood history, was never short on potential quests that could put our titular hero in different exotic locations and dangerous predicaments. But most of these concepts were completely absurd, and would have probably driven the series into a ditch long before he decided to send Indy after aliens. Listening to some of his pitches, it seems like he was just indulging every bizarre idea that came to his mind and then expecting the writers to make it work somehow.
While Spielberg provided a moderation check on some of Lucas's more embarrassing impulses, he contributed almost no new ideas of his own.
The other grave goods that we found in the area.
He often maintained that the series was really George's creative offspring and that he was merely shepherding the project for his close friend.
You know, this is a movie that I'm making for George from his idea. It's of his being.
But from the very first sequel, he was petitioning to bring back characters and settings from Raiders, while Lucas was trying to branch out into unexplored territory. Under Spielberg's direction, the series became more about Indiana Jones the character, and less about the grand, thrilling adventures that originally formed its core appeal, evidenced by the fact that the first film is not called Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Ark.
The problem is, Indiana Jones is more of an archetype than he is a three-dimensional character. We as the audience want to see him embarking on exciting journeys into perilous situations. We don't really care about his impotent rage toward his dad, or his struggles to settle down and forego his playboy ways before his AARP discount kicks in. Reviewing the sequels in this light, only Temple of Doom manages to blaze its own trail and fully realize the potential of the episodic format. Last Crusade and Crystal Skull may have their own unique MacGuffins, but they both lean heavily on Raiders for their supporting cast, and can't help but reference it constantly and clumsily. Originally envisioned as a pastiche of different pulp adventure stories, the Indiana Jones series slowly became a pastiche of itself.
Are you sure?
Pretty sure.
There is, of course, an elephant in the room that hasn't been addressed yet. We have to talk about Harrison. Dear, sweet Harrison. It's probably not controversial to say, but Harrison Ford basically is Indiana Jones. Finding out that the part was originally written for Tom Selleck seems like the highest of heresy.
Hello, Mary.
And Lucas was initially adamant not to cast Ford after hiring him for American Graffiti and Star Wars. But he was just so undeniably perfect for the role that Lucas soon relented. And to this day, it's hard to imagine any other actor attempting to fill his hat.
That should do it.
He's also well known for doing as much of his own stunt work as he could, repeatedly getting injured on set during the original trilogy and taking it like a champ.
I'm sure it's not dangerous. See, if it was dangerous, they would wait until we got more of the movie done.
These movies are meant to be extremely physical, and though he's rapidly approaching his 81st birthday, Ford is much too integral to the character to ever be replaced by a younger actor.
Who would you like to see as Indiana Jones?
Nobody is going to be Indiana Jones.
Ever.
Don't you get it?
No one.
I'm Indiana Jones.
So when you're gone, it's gone.
When I'm gone, he's gone. It's easy.
Oh, Harrison. If only it were that simple.
In 2012, Lucas made the timeline-altering decision to sell Lucasfilm to the Walt Disney Corporation.
I am Mickey Mouse.
As soon as this news broke, we all knew it was only a matter of time before they tried resurrecting the series on which Crystal Skull had closed the casket. But in a rare feat of restraint, Disney would go quiet on this front until almost 5 years later, when they announced that a fifth Indiana Jones film was officially in development. Despite Crystal Skull already stretching the believability of an elderly Indiana Jones, it seems Disney is determined to keep this gravy train rolling no matter what. Though they repeatedly dismissed speculation that they would deepfake or recast the character,
it's never gonna happen.
They've apparently hedged their bets by utilizing both digital de-aging and a new Pass the Torch sidekick in the film, titled Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny. But judging by its dismal early reviews, followed by the prompt cancellation of another planned Young Indiana Jones series, even the dark forces of Disney may be unable to wield the power of this ancient sacred artifact.
Don't look at it. Shut your eyes, Marion. Don't look at it no matter what happens.